So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Officers Association webinar. It's the third in our series of Working Lunch webinars, where we'll be looking at CVs, cover letters, and job applications. My name is Clive, Lowe, and I'm joined by our highly experienced career consultants, Fiona Jackson and Lisa Jones. As I mentioned, this is the third in our series of lunchtime webinars. And it follows next week with interview preparation and practice, and then finally with salary negotiations and onboarding. It's designed to take you through the whole process from deciding to change careers to actually arriving at the other end and starting your new role. And to talk us through this, I'm delighted to welcome my colleagues. First of all, Lisa Jones, OA Career Consultant. Lisa, can you just give us a few words of your background, please?
Of course, thanks, Clive. I myself was an army officer. I left quite a while ago now, but when I left, I went into a career in banking, working with two top-tier investment banks. And during that time, I did quite a lot of recruitment myself, sifted through a lot of CVs, but I've been with the OA now for almost 9 years. And so I've also had a lot of experience there. So I'm hoping that both my corporate experience, my military experience, and my experience at the OA as a coach and career consultant can help to offer you advice today.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you so much. And joining Lisa is my other colleague, Fiona Jackson. Fiona, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, nice that you were all able to join us today, which is great. Like Lisa, I had a background in the army, but it was a much longer time ago than Lisa. So, and after I left the army, I actually went to work for John Lewis for quite some time in an HR role, mainly around talent management and succession planning. But I also did quite a lot of recruiting, both bulk recruiting for Christmas temporary staff, graduates, and individual recruitment as well. Since then, I've worked mainly in the third sector, and in fact, I had a role with the charity voluntary services overseas as international recruitment manager. So again, like Lisa, I have looked at an awful lot of CVs, and I hope you find what we say today is going to be of real value and use to you.
Sure we will. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Lisa. So can I pose this question first to you, Fiona? So what are we actually going to be covering in this webinar?
Yeah, thanks, Clive, of course. And as Clive says, we've got 30 minutes, but we can take some questions. And if we don't have time to answer them at the end, then we can get back to you via email. I'm sure you've often thought this, but applying for a job can be daunting, especially if you haven't done it for some time, or for some of our clients have never done it apart from applying to the military. So what we're going to start doing is we'll start by looking at how you apply for the job from the moment you see it advertised or someone tells you about it. They said, oh, you must apply for that job, you know, it looks really good, would be suitable for you. Then we will cover the mechanics of a CV and why it is important to get it right. As Lisa and I have both said, we've seen an awful lot of CVs, and we've seen some really good ones and some not quite so good ones. But you want your CV to have real impact and to stand out from the crowd, but in a positive way, not in a negative way. What about the covering letter? People ask us about that, and is it necessary? We'll cover that. And then the final thing is we will talk about the fact that for some roles, particularly in public sector, an application form will be required. It will not be via CV.
So, Lisa, if someone sees a job, how do they know if that's the right job for them?
So I think as we've covered in previous webinars, talking about, you know, doing your research and, you know, looking at different sectors and then individual organisations within those sectors. So obviously that's the first stage. By the time you've got to that stage and you've identified a particular organisation that you think would be right for you, it can then be an additional hurdle to think, well, you know, what kind of job should I go for? You know, what level broadly translates into the level that I should be aiming at? And different organisations have lots of different jargon. What is termed a manager or a senior manager in one organisation might be very different, might be perceived very differently in another. So that's kind of like another layer of research that you have to do. But I think if you've identified a job that you think chimes with your background and experience and skills, and it kind of speaks to you, if you like, and you want to apply for it, obviously checking that it's at the right level is an important stage. So perhaps understanding the structure of the organisation before you look at jobs is also important. And by that, I would just basically look at jobs on a website and think, right, these, I like the look of these, perhaps print them off, or, you know, whatever it is, memorize what they're called or what they are, and then arrange for a chat with somebody within an organisation and say to them, listen, you know, I've seen these jobs, I really like the sound of them, but I'm frankly confused as to what the level means and whether that is the right level for me. And if they're an ex-military person, you know, they will understand that if you're a flight lieutenant or a captain, you're at a certain level, major or lieutenant colonel, you're at a different level. So I think they can help you untangle that, because it can be very confusing. The next thing to do is to look at the job description and then look at it and think about, how do my skills and background chime with these things that the organisation is actually looking for. And I think that is a really, really important stage, and we'll cover that in more detail. But, you know, a lot of people kind of gloss over that, or they think, oh, that sounds about right for me, but that's really not enough. You've got to really think about it. And if you're not sure, speak to somebody and network, because really that is the best way of kind of untangling some of this jargon and working out if a job is right for you.
Thanks, Lisa. So you've just mentioned that the job descriptions can be quite prescriptive, but Fiona, does somebody have to match exactly the requirements in the job description, or can you be there or thereabouts?
Yeah, thanks, Clive. I mean, ideally, I'm sure the employer would want somebody to 100% meet the requirements of the job. That's probably not always very realistic. But I certainly think you should be looking at the job and saying, can I meet sort of 80% of the requirements? And don't necessarily write yourself out of a job, but also don't sort of think you can do something when the answer is you probably can't, like must have commercial experience. But I would go back to what Lisa was saying as well, that if you're not sure about the exact requirements and whether you fit them, you can always ask the recruitment consultant if the job is being advertised by a recruitment consultancy, or try and phone up somebody within the organisation to find out. However, I think some things are really probably deal breakers, and I can just think of a couple of examples that I've had. You know, somebody wanting to apply for a role and it said must be a qualified chartered accountant, and the person wasn't, so I suggested, well, there was no point in applying for that job. Or someone else who wanted to apply for a job and they had to have fluency in a certain language and they didn't have that, and I said, again, there is no point you applying for the job. And I suppose what I'm saying there is, don't waste your time on lengthy applications if actually, you know, there are certain things that you just do not have and they are absolutely critical. But understand what the organisation is looking for and why. Do your research and tailor your CV. So, for example, I mentioned earlier about commercial experience. You might not have commercial experience because you've been in the military. However, it could be that you've done an MBA, you've run a significant budget, you've done the finance for non-finance managers. So you could put that in your CV or covering letter and show that at least you are trying to address some of the issues. But I think going back to the end of Lisa's slide, it's network. Do your research, understand what the organisation is looking for, and take some advice.
Thank you, Fiona. So Fiona said that you should tailor your CV. So Lisa, could somebody apply for a job using a generic CV, or do you think they should tailor their CV to every different application that they make?
I think that a generic CV is a useful thing to have. And I think when you're networking, if you're not necessarily looking at applying for a job at that point, then having a generic CV is absolutely fine. And sometimes when you're networking, people might say to you, can I have a look at your CV? Can you send me your CV? You know, that kind of thing. And of course, having something ready to send is quite important. But if you're actually applying for a job, then absolutely yes, you must tailor it to that job. And I think that what that says to an employer, firstly, is that you're serious. Secondly, that you've invested in them and the job, and that you're, you know, invested your own time in tailoring your CV. And thirdly, it just shows that you're actually interested and that you're really trying to demonstrate how your skills could be relevant to them. So I think it really sends out a very positive message. I think if I read a CV for a job that does not speak to the needs of that job, I immediately think that the person isn't seriously applying for the job, and then they've just kind of sent in an application as a punt. I say here, ensure that your message is relevant, and that really does start from the top. So, you know, if you are applying for a job and it wants you to be a qualified program manager, and you are a qualified program manager, then say that right from the outset. Don't start it with a senior manager in the armed forces or an experienced lieutenant colonel in the Royal Artillery or something like that, because although that might be true, if that's not relevant to the job that you're applying for, they will immediately not understand why you're telling them that. In your profile, I think try and keep it as short and sweet and also factual. We see a lot of profiles that start off with waffle, such as, you know, dynamic, motivated, enthusiastic. You know, that's all very nice and very nice qualities to have, but they're not factual. That's not factual information that will tell me why I should hire you. So try and describe the environment you've been working in, the level you're operating at, the type of level of responsibility you have. If you have sector experience, absolutely put that in. And as Fiona said about commercial experience, you know, a lot of military people won't have commercial experience, but if you've built relationships with external organisations, perhaps in the defence sector, or, you know, in certain projects or programs that you've run, then that's all relevant information. Then moving on from the profile, the key skills section is where you can really start speaking to the needs of that organisation and the specific role that they're advertising. So make sure that the skills that you're highlighting and offering an organisation are firstly what you're good at, secondly what the job is actually asking for, and finally things that you can actually back up and prove. And in this section, I quite like to see, rather than just a list of skills that doesn't really mean anything and might just be copied and pasted from the job advert, I'd like to see you bring this to life with reference to you and your background, not in huge detail, just a line or so, but something that's really going to grab the reader's attention and then encourage them to read more. Because your profile and your key skills section sitting at the top of the document is what I call the impact area. And that is where you are basically trying to encourage the reader to carry on reading and not put your CV into file 13. So then we go into the career history, and rather than just describing your jobs, you know, no one needs to know what, you know, the responsibilities of, you know, a Squadron 2 IC are, but what they need to know is why those things that you've achieved in that job are relevant to them. So if you've demonstrated organisational skills, leadership skills, risk management skills, project management skills, think about those things and bring them out in your career history, not just saying responsible for this, responsible for that. And above all, focus on what you've delivered the outcomes and try and measure these if you can. So if you've improved something, try and think by how much. Can you put a percentage on that? What was the outcome of you being in that role, rather than just turning up to work and being responsible for things?
Lisa, could I just add something in there? Is that okay? I mean, I totally agree with everything you're saying, and you know, that if the organisation, to go back to what you were saying about the profile and looking for a program manager, that's what you start with. However, I also think at some point you have to state that you are in the military, because I read a lot of CVs, and I'm sure you have done, where you can read the whole CV and at the end of it you don't know that the person's been in the military. So there also has to be context in you gained your program management experience working on a major procurement program at Abbey Wood or whatever as an officer in the military.
Absolutely, definitely do not hide the fact that you've been in the military, because that is where your career has been developed. And it is, you know, your history, your career history has been in the military. But I would say just don't lead with it. So as Fiona says, you know, say blah, 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 skills developed during a 10-year career as an officer in the Royal Navy or whatever it might be. Clive, I know we had a question earlier around of how not to brag or be seen to be bragging
that's right, yeah.
And I think this is where a lot of military people do find this fairly uncomfortable, because essentially a CV is a sales document. It's the aim of a CV is to sell you and your skills to a future employer. So there does have to be an element of you kind of, you know, showcasing what it is that you've got to offer. But absolutely, I understand that people feel very uncomfortable about what might be perceived as bragging. So how do you address that? Well, what I always say is just be factual, but also be relevant. So if a program that you ran was worth billions of pounds and you think that sounds a bit over the top, and you know, or the equipment that you were responsible for, because it was aircraft or tanks, was worth a considerable amount of money, and you think that might sound a bit mind-blowing to somebody, then think to yourself, is this relevant to the job that I'm applying for? And you know, if it isn't, then I don't think you necessarily need to spell it out, because I think sometimes military people have had exposure to some quite significant things, such as leadership positions. I always remember when I left the army and I went for this job in a bank in Morgan Stanley, one of the questions they asked me at interview was, you know, you're going to be coming in at this level, which means you won't be, you know, a team leader or, you know, responsible for anyone in a team, but you've come from a position where you in the army where you have been leading a team. How will you find that? Will you find that difficult? And you know, I think if I had kind of tried to big up my leadership and banged on about how marvelous I was at it and how I, you know, leading teams was my passion, and that wasn't the job that I was going for, then obviously that would have not sounded quite right. So I think whilst leadership can be in your background, you don't necessarily need to kind of make a huge deal about it in your application or in your CV if it's not relevant to the role. But I think mentioning it is important, because it is something, a skill that you possess and something that you might be good at. So what a company can then think is, okay, we're not going to bring this person in at a leadership position now, but we can look at them potentially for the future. And most military people, if they don't go in in a leadership position within an organisation, they do tend to move towards that relatively quickly and more quickly than peers. So in answer to that question about bragging, I say be factual, but also be relevant. And, you know, if anyone wants to make an appointment with either me or Fiona to discuss their CV in detail, absolutely, that's something that you can do.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to keep you on camera, if I may, and ask you for the next slide. So what about covering letters? Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, so I mean, not all jobs will ask for a covering letter, but some do. And absolutely, if they ask for one, then do provide one. Sometimes, if they don't ask for one, you can perhaps treat the email with which you send your covering letter, so your CV to a job application, you can treat that a bit like a covering letter. I have to say, it is true that some covering letters will not be read, even when they've been asked for. And that is from the horse's mouth of some recruiters that I have spoken to and some HR people. Why is that? Why do they ask for it when they're not even going to read it? The honest answer is I don't know. It might have something to do with how many applications they receive, you know, whether they've got time to go through that kind of thing. But I would say, you know, absolutely, regardless of that, if you're asked for one, then do provide one. And what I really think is that a covering letter is your chance to really bring yourself to life. As I say here, show your passion for the industry or the organisation that you're applying to, and, you know, really make it about you and about how you're a really good fit for that role. Whereas a CV, I think, although we've said make your CV relevant, you have got a kind of, you know, a limited space in which to do that. So I think that's where the covering letter can be quite useful in really kind of hammering home the areas where you feel you could really add value. And most importantly, that your background and experience is really relevant to that organisation. Also, demonstrating passion for the industry or that you've done research into an organisation is a really attractive thing to a hiring manager, because the amount of times that I interviewed people who quite clearly had, you know, we were just another organisation on their list of jobs to apply for. They hadn't really done any research. They didn't know anything about us as an organisation, what we were doing at the moment, what was important to us, challenges that we'd faced. So I think if I did meet people and interview them who had done that research, I was always very impressed. And you can allude to that. Obviously, you're not going to give chapter and verse, but you can allude to it in your covering letter. Be succinct. 1 page is ideal. And, you know, really do try and stick to that, because if people have only got a limited amount of time to skim a covering letter, as they do a CV, then you really need to bring your points, your relevant points, home as quickly as you can. And I would do that by addressing the requirements of the job in a clear way. And what you might want to do is perhaps bring out 3 or perhaps up to 5 areas from the job spec where you really feel that you meet the requirements, and almost have them as bulleted headings or headings in bold and paragraphs, you know, but try and use bullets and try and be succinct, because I think, as I say, people will scan it, and if there's just a huge block of text, they're probably not going to read it. So make the reader's life easy, make it clear, and make it succinct.
Thanks, Lisa. So Fiona, what about application forms? I think the public sector uses application forms.
Yes, you're right, Clive. Quite a number of organisations still do use application forms, and you mentioned public sector, the third sector as well, but even some big organisations like John Lewis would ask you to complete an application form for certain roles. So it is something that you have to get used to. I'm sure for some of you who've already done it, completing an application form can be time consuming, because they often want to know, you know, right back to your GCSEs or all your jobs and the dates, the exact dates you did them and so on. So it can be a very time consuming exercise. And what I would say is, for the first one you do, save a copy so that then, if possible, you can copy and paste for any future forms, or at least you've got the information all in one place and you don't have to go back and try and find it in lots of different folders that you've got. I'd also say address what they want. Sometimes I feel with application forms that people decide what they're going to tell the organisation rather than addressing the questions that are being asked. And it goes back again to Lisa saying about being relevant, you know, that you only need to say things that are relevant. And for example, particularly with the career history, some organisations would actually have a list of competencies and ask you to show or demonstrate how you meet the competencies, and you can use examples from various jobs you've done to do that, but also make sure that you focus on not just what you did, which shows you were using the competency, but also what was the outcome or the value added that you did. So if a competency was management of risk or whatever, then make sure you could give an example of how you managed risk in a certain situation and what was the outcome, i.e. you prevented accidents happening, you increase the safety rate or whatever. It's really important to stay within the word limit, and if it's online, sometimes that you won't be able to go beyond the word limit, but make sure that you do stay in the word limit. And I would go back to what Lisa was saying as well about chunks of block text are really difficult to read, so break your text down into smaller paragraphs or bullet points, and also do your research and ask for tips from others. So if you know somebody who, let's say, is working in the civil service or in the NHS and they've had to go through this process, ask them for their tips. Well, how did you make the grade by doing this? As well as sort of not writing huge long paragraphs, keep your writing short and punchy. You're not writing an essay or a worthy staff paper, and always check for spelling mistakes and typos, and get somebody else to check for you, because sometimes, and I'm sure you know, with spell check, it could say that you've written the word correctly, but it's the wrong spelling of a particular word, i.e. principal or principal. So make sure that you check. And I remember when I worked for John Lewis, I don't know if I should be telling you this, and when we were doing sort of mass recruiting for Christmas Thames, if anybody hadn't bothered to even write in sentences or use punctuation, then generally, you know, that application was very low down on my list of wanting to be considered, because, you know, even if you're not brilliant at writing in good clear English, you can always get somebody else to check it for you. Thanks, Clive.
Oh, thank you, Fiona.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, I just wanted to say that I was chatting to someone recently who'd done an application form for the civil service, and he had kind of, you know, filled it in with all the relevant competencies, and obviously they gave him feedback afterwards. He wasn't successful. They gave him some feedback about, you know, what his score had been and where he hadn't quite met the mark. And one area that he didn't score very highly on was leadership, which obviously he was quite surprised about, as he was a military officer, and, you know, leadership was a huge part of his career. But I think what it just shows is that your definition of leadership and the organisation that you're applying to's definition might be slightly different. So again, you know, doing your research and asking for tips from others is hugely important, because, you know, just ask, you know, what do they mean by leadership? And if they mean, you know, they really want you to talk about, you know, delivering change, then that's one thing. But if they want us, if what they're really meaning is writing appraisals, then that's something else. And if you understand that, then you can tailor your application and your answer accordingly. And you know, I'm sure any military person would be mortified to be, you know, find that leadership had let them down. But it's just the way that you phrase things and what you bring out as being relevant.
I think you're absolutely right, Lisa, and it may be also the person has really good leadership experience, but the way they've explained it and with a lack of outcome or value added doesn't really show anything to the person who's reading the application form. So yeah, definitely.
Great stuff, thank you. So we're coming to the end of the webinar. We've just about used up all our time. Fiona, any final messages?
Well, they're all relevant, but I'll just start at the top, really. And it goes back to what we've been saying and reiterating throughout the presentation, is network. So it's not just networking in order to, hope somebody can give you a job. It's networking to understand about the organisations that interest you, the roles that would suit your background and skills, and what level you should apply. And it is the old adage, the time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted, because you're building up a really good bank of knowledge. And also, if you get to interview stage, you're showing the organisation that you have done research and that you do understand the market, or you do understand the problems of that particular NHS trust or whatever it is. So it shows that you're serious about the application, and that you've taken the time and have had the courtesy to do your research.
Lisa, did you like to add to that? Any final messages?
But yeah, I mean, obviously people can read what's on the screen, but really, I think what Fiona's just said is that, if you've done some research on an organisation, then let it show, and be relevant. And I think that's the main problem with a lot of CVs that I see, is that people describe their jobs and don't think about what an organisation might want. So really, keep it relevant. And, how do you find that out? Again, network. So, the networking is the first phase, but don't lose that knowledge. Keep it in mind when you're filling in the application form, when you're writing your CV, and just ask for help every step of the way, either from the OA or from people who've gone before you. The military network is absolutely fantastic and will really help to support you.
I think, again, you're right, Lisa, and I just wanted to add to that. I've seen a lot of people, when they write covering letters, write a long letter about, why they want the job, and it could even be because it's near to where I live or whatever, but don't actually say, but what can I do for your organisation? Why would you want to hire me? And so really think about that, rather than what you want to get out of the job. So rather than saying, well, I'm looking to this job because it's at the right salary level, or it's going to give me the progression I want, you're going to be saying, well, I've just come from running a major program, and I can see that you're in the middle of a major program and you want somebody to take it further. And so you're almost like helping to solve their problem by presenting what it is you've got that they want.
Absolutely. Just quickly, I've seen somebody has asked a question about if a CV sift is done, not by a real human, how do you get around that? Well, I'll just say two things about that. One is, make sure you speak to the needs of the job and reflect the language that they've used, because those are the words that the computer, if you like, will be searching for. But the second and perhaps more important thing is, don't rely on that alone. If you network and you know somebody within the organisation, once you've applied for the job, let that person know that you've applied for the job and get them to follow up internally and make sure that your application or your CV gets seen by a real person. Now, that might not be possible in all cases, but a good word put in by a real person can help resurrect a CV from one pile to being in the invite for interview pile.
I think we've got a second question, actually, but if we could go on to the final slide. The second question is about where to find and where to get further advice. So, Fiona, can you run through that for us?
Okay, well, I would say, if you haven't done it already, register with the Officers Association to arrange an appointment with a career consultant, with Lisa or with me. And we can be quite specific about what we discuss with you. So it could be a sort of full career consultation and CV review. You might just want to discuss your CV and your LinkedIn profile. You might want advice on interview skills, how to complete an application form. we will tailor the session around what it is that you want. You've also got access, if you register with us, to a targeted jobs board. Our recruitment manager and our key account managers work with employers who specifically want to recruit ex-military people, and so therefore have things in mind. I don't know, like they might want a nuclear engineer or an avionics engineer or something like that, but the jobs board is targeted. You will also have access to our network contact list. Now, currently with that list, there are probably over 500 names on it, and they're all people who have been clients of ours and are known to us, and they're all willing to give advice and support. So even if you don't know them, they don't mind you contacting them because they volunteered to do this, because somebody helped them in their transition, and therefore they're happy to help other people, so they're going to pay back. You'll have an open invitation to regular events like this one, and events that are run in conjunction with other organisations like PA Consulting and so on. And then we do send out weekly newsletters with sort of top jobs, the latest events coming up, just to remind you if you haven't got time to regularly go into our events page or our jobs board.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So just to conclude then, a big thank you to Fiona and Lisa for the excellent advice you've given us today, and to all of you who've joined us for this webinar this afternoon. The next in the series is next Thursday, 27th of May, interview preparation and practice, and the final one in the series on salary negotiations and onboarding is on the 10th of June. They both start at 1 p.m. If you'd like to contact Fiona or Lisa, or arrange a career consultation to get further advice, or indeed if you haven't already registered with the OA, and I would encourage you to do so, then please use the client.admin email address there to post your inquiry or to find out more. But just remains me to say, Fiona, Lisa, thank you both very much indeed, and a very informative and interesting webinar. And thank you all, and I hope you all have a very nice afternoon.
I also wanted to say yes, thank you, and if we haven't met you already, hope we'll meet you soon.